To begin with the war in Gaza and a bold diplomatic move as France, one of Israel's leading European partners, has announced it will recognize Palestinian statehood. President Emmanuel Macron wrote on X that he plans to make an announcement to the UN General Assembly in September. He also said that peace was possible and called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. However, those efforts appeared to have stalled today. The U.S. recalled its negotiating team after the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, said the latest response from Hamas showed, quote, a lack of desire to reach a deal. The pullout contrasts sharply with hints of optimism, which CNN had previously heard from sources. A separate official with knowledge of the talks had characterized Hamas's response as positive. Hamas itself is rejecting Witkoff's remarks, this happening just moments ago. A delay in a deal risks prolonging the hunger crisis now unfolding inside Gaza, where the health ministry is warning that 900,000 children are going hungry there. Israel denies it's at fault, accuses Hamas of, quote, engineering food shortages. Today, thousands of Israelis gathered in Tel Aviv calling for a ceasefire and the return of all hostages taken by Hamas during the terror attack on October 7th. That is 1 year, 9 months, and 16 days ago. More now from CNN's Jeremy Diamond. A warning, as so often, you may find some of these images disturbing.
There are no bullet holes or shrapnel wounds marking this man's body. His bears the signs of a far more silent killer: starvation. At 41 years old, Mohammed al-Hassanat is one of at least 45 Palestinians who have died of malnutrition in just the last week, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. An entirely man-made humanitarian crisis in Gaza, now reaching unprecedented levels. The question now is not whether starvation will claim more lives, but who will be its next victim. Most food stocks have run dry. Malnutrition cases are skyrocketing, and there is only so much Gaza's under-resourced hospitals can do. At one of the few soup kitchens still serving meals, the growing desperation of Gaza's population of more than 2 million is clear as day. 28 Western nations, more than 100 humanitarian aid organizations, and top UN officials have all said Israeli policies are to blame for the starvation crisis now unfolding. That's because Israel imposed a total siege of Gaza between March and May. And since then, Israeli restrictions on the entry and distribution of aid have snowballed into an utterly avoidable disaster.
I don't know what you would call it other than mass starvation. And it's man-made, and that's very clear. And this is because of blockade.
Israel denies it is using starvation as a weapon, pointing to hundreds of aid trucks inside Gaza awaiting UN pickup. The UN says Israeli authorities have repeatedly failed to authorize safe routes to pick up those stockpiles. But the reality of starvation is impossible to deny, including for Israeli news channels, which rarely broadcast such images. Fadia Abu Namus has been in line since 6 a.m., hoping to fill a pot of lentil soup to feed the 9 members of her family. We've had enough of starvation and oppression, enough of staying in the streets like dogs, where no one looks at us, where we can't find anything for our children to eat or drink. Signs of hunger are everywhere in Gaza. This man collapsed while sifting through the wreckage of the latest Israeli offensive. He says he hasn't eaten anything lately but scraps of bread. Moments later, his body gives out on him again. He's simply too weak to go on. Jeremy Diamond, CNN, Tel Aviv.
Joining me now is Omer Bartov, a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University, the author of a recent piece in the New York Times titled, "I'm a Genocide Scholar, I Know It When I See It." Mr. Bartov, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
The UN definition of a genocide, as you know, is, quote, the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. In your piece, you make the case, one, that you did not believe at the beginning of Israeli operations in Gaza that it was a genocide. Now you believe it is. Tell us why your view changed.
Yeah, and let me just continue the sentence of the definition, which says in whole or in part as such. And so when I started looking at what was happening in Gaza after the Hamas attack of October 7th, within a few weeks, it was quite clear that war crimes were being committed by the IDF as well as potentially crimes against humanity. And there had been statements by Israeli political and military leaders that indicated a genocidal intent. But it was not clear that this was being implemented. And over the few months after that, by spring of 2024, it became increasingly clear that what Israel was trying to do was not, as it said, to destroy Hamas and to release the hostages, but in fact to make Gaza uninhabitable for its population. And that's what it is doing right now as well.
Just today, in fact, the Minister of Heritage for Israel, Amichay Eliyahu, said in an interview that the government is racing to have Gaza wiped out. In the meantime, thank God we are wiping out this evil and wiping out the population that was educated on Mein Kampf. So you have had public statements to that effect, even from some members of the current government. But what you hear, and I've interviewed many of them on this broadcast from Israeli officials, is that if Hamas were to cede power in Gaza, were to leave, if this terrorist group were to leave, then those operations would end. What's your response to that argument?
Well, you would have to believe them. There is no world in which the IDF would leave Gaza if Hamas left. In fact, negotiations were over that. It was possible to have Hamas leadership leave Gaza, end the war, and return the hostages. But that's not what Israel wants. What this government wants is to take over Gaza, take over the territory, and empty it of as many of the people in it as possible. And it claims that it's destroying Gaza because Hamas is using the population as human shields. But in fact, what the IDF is engaged in since last summer is not a war at all. What it is engaged in is demolition of Gaza. There are bulldozers everywhere. The tanks, the militias, there are viewing points on the other side of the border for people watching how the IDF and independent contractors being brought in and paid handsomely to destroy every building that stands in Gaza so as to flatten it, as was promised initially by Israeli political leaders right after October 7th, make it uninhabitable, if possible, remove the population, and then have people move in, settlers move into it.
You cited in your piece in the New York Times, and you've mentioned elsewhere, that the deliberate destruction of Rafah by Israeli forces demonstrated to you that Israel's intent is to make Gaza uninhabitable. But it is true that Hamas lives and breathes among the Palestinian people in Gaza and will often base itself behind or under or within civilian populations and even civilian buildings, such as hospitals. Could both of those things be true?
Yes, of course. And Israel had a right to say after October 7th that it needed to launch a military operation to destroy Hamas. But if the military operation was planned to do that, then it would not have looked the way it looks now. So what Israel actually engaged in was not what it said it was doing. It hasn't destroyed Hamas, it has destroyed Gaza. And the goal was really to use this opportunity of the Hamas attack on October 7th to finally solve the issue of Gaza by removing the population from it and destroying it. The point is that if you respond to an attack, a terrorist attack, as was launched by Hamas, and there's nothing to condone that, it was a war crime and a crime against humanity, by then deciding to perpetrate genocide on 2 million people, then you cannot claim to have the high moral ground. Then you have actually become just like your enemy.
President Trump, U.S. President Trump, at times has said, he's at least repeated the language, well, Gaza is uninhabitable, right? That perhaps it's impossible for people to leave there, so there's another solution. You've heard him talk about turning it into a beach resort, but even entertained at times the idea of moving the people of Gaza out temporarily, often qualified as temporarily. Do you see the U.S. president, the U.S. government as opening the door, at least, to that possibility of forcing the population out of Gaza?
Absolutely. Look, what President Trump said at the time when he was meeting Netanyahu, he later was not entirely consistent with that. But in Israel, and especially in government circles, this was greeted as a carte blanche. This meant that we can do it. And when Israel unilaterally broke the ceasefire in March this year, it immediately began engaging precisely in that policy. And we know that the head of the Mossad was visiting Washington, and that there are debates now or negotiations over moving Palestinians to Indonesia, Libya, and Ethiopia.
You lived in Israel yourself for much of your life. You served in the IDF, and you wrote that this is a painful conclusion for you to reach. You grew up in a Zionist household. So I wonder, what has the reaction that you've received from stating this position now, calling Israeli activities in Gaza a genocide? How have fellow Israelis reacted to you and others in this country?
Well, look, I mean, I have to say that a lot of people wrote me and said and thanked me for trying to say as clearly and dispassionately as I could what I believed was happening there. And people feel that it's very difficult for people to recognize that, because it is a scandal. And I feel that it is a scandal, that the state of Israel that I was born and raised in and served in the army for and was in a war for, a state that was founded in the wake of the Holocaust as an answer to the genocide of the Jews, would now, all these decades later, be engaged in precisely the same thing. So there are many people who deny it because they